thing, you will say, well, this institution is overexposed, and there's a risk there, and you have to call it as such.
Thank you very much, Dr. Byrne. Ambassador Francis.
Thank you, Dr. Prado. With the permission of my minister, Minister Dukaran, I'd like to make a comment that I hope will cause a reaction from the panel. There is a major environmental problem that we have in the Caribbean, and it's directly related to trade. Trade in reconditioned goods, used cars. It clogs our highways, it pollutes our atmosphere, it causes a huge deficit in productivity, and it probably impacts the health and well-being of our populations. It's what the economists call externalities. Now, in the discussion on sustainable development, the international community has by and large accepted the principle that there must be national ownership for sustainable development. It's a very cute way of saying development is your responsibility. You must own it, and the duty to mobilize the resources to achieve it resides with you at the national level. So the first requirement is the mobilization of domestic resources. Mm-hmm. And in the context of mobilization, I think that there is an opportunity in the continuing high level of imports of used vehicles that directly affect and impact our sustainability, given the levels of carbon emissions that they generate, for governments to conceptualize some sort of action. I know that as a public, we don't like taxes in the Caribbean. But I think the point has to be made among Caribbean people, and they must understand that we will not achieve development for nothing or for free. We have got to pay for it. Through our taxes and in other ways, we have got to pay for it. And so I think there's this opportunity to create a link between the importation, the heavy importation of these vehicles that perhaps might give us the feel-good sense of achievement in our mobility, but that in fact undermines in a way the community rights. We haven't spoken much about community rights in this conference this week, but they exist, whether we acknowledge them or not, because the rights of the community certainly have to be taken into account in developing any concept of what Caribbean development is going to be. And so I think there's this potential to link fiscal policy with the importation of these used vehicles in the volumes that they come, that could help and assist and support in the mobilization of domestic resources. It doesn't solve the problem that Professor Bourne talked about, because if this happens, maybe the money might go to the bank, but then the question becomes, how does the process of financial intermediation take place to ensure that the money gets used in a developmental way? And I think in that as well, there is a role for the government, because that money can probably and should be used then to finance green projects, so that we get the bounce on the other end of the transaction. Carbon emission being used to finance green, clean, safe, sustainable development. I'd like to get the comments of the panel on that, please.
Muchas gracias, embajador. Thank you very much, Ambassador. And I'll give the floor to Ms. Hurley, and after to Governor of the Central Bank. Ms. Hurley, please.
Thank you, moderator, and thanks to all of you for your very insightful comments and reflections. And thanks in particular for reminding us that it's about, financing for who and financing for what, and the importance of investing differently, because of course we can develop all, different kinds of innovative financing solutions if we like, but if they're not spent well, then they're worth very little, of course. I think what has become clear this afternoon is that there's no magic solution. If there was a magic solution, we wouldn't all be sitting here this afternoon. We'd probably be all very rich and off somewhere having some leisure time. Professor Bourne just outlined, how difficult it is really to raise revenues. And there's no single financing solution, of course, for sustainable development. But I am very encouraged, though, because there are lots of initiatives being developed around the world in different regions that are going in the right direction. And there are major opportunities, I think, presented by some of those for this region. There's a lot of work, for instance, in the area of natural capital accounting being done that's really great. There are going to be increases in resources for climate change adaptation with the launch of the Green Climate Fund, so there are opportunities there. We're seeing some, major expansions in green bonds, the development of blue bonds, interest in diaspora bonds, social impact bonds, vaccine bonds, catastrophe bonds, GDP-linked bonds, a variety of financial instruments being created designed to reduce vulnerability and risk and provide more affordable finance for governments. And, those kinds of more socially aware investments, I think, will only increase in the future. So I think there are major opportunities presented there. But I will add a word of caution to that, because they are all debt instruments. So, of course, debt has to be carefully managed, especially where debt levels are high. Let me just add one very final point, very quickly. It's a personal story. I think the key challenge for many governments is the cash easy or is the cash difficult to obtain? And I say that because I was invited to Rwanda 2 years ago precisely on this question of innovative financing to help the government think about the ways it could diversify its sources of finance, both domestic and external. So, for instance, we looked at opportunities to expand green finance, opportunities to expand South-South cooperation and sustainable infrastructure finance. We looked at the possibilities for diaspora bonds for Rwanda, public-private partnership opportunities, tourism levies, which could be developed. And we did some great calculations. We looked at the pros and cons of different approaches, who would be the winners, who would be the losers. And I'm concluding now by saying that the challenge that we face is that, before, as we developed all of these great ideas, and before we presented them to the government went to market and got the bond finance from the market, because that's easy. It might be more expensive, but it's easier. So in lots of cases, we have to simplify some of these sources of finance much more than is currently the case.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Ms. Hurley. Mr. Rambaran, please.
Sure. In the interest of time, I'll just make one key point, and that is financing for development. Yes, it is about human development, but I think this audience seems to miss a fundamental fact, that there's a political reality around financing for development and an international political reality, and that you don't seem to appreciate that Caribbean governments have reached the limit as to where they can go when it comes to financing the future of the Caribbean. And therefore, when we start to say, we talk about one person talk about the low carbon development strategy in Guyana, are you aware that Guyana is unable to unlock any more climate financing at the moment from that strategy? You said you didn't hear anything innovative, yet you mentioned Guyana. Yes, that was an innovative strategy, but it has now bounced up against the international community and the world of geopolitics. We talk about the per capita GDP income and the fact that we are upper to middle income countries, and therefore on that basis we're not eligible for concessional financing. Yet, you have to face that reality within the context of the multilateral development banks, particularly the IMF, the World Bank, and the IDB, where when you start to talk about vulnerability as a criteria, how difficult it is to move from GDP per capita to vulnerability as a criteria for accessing financing. There's one person mentioned, well, he doesn't trust governments. Well, if you don't trust governments, I don't know who you're going to trust to move the trajectory forward. Because in this part of the region, you do not have a private sector that is extremely risk-taking. And therefore, you always find it falls back on the governments to take that particular level of risk and move countries forward. Therefore, when we start to talk about financing for development, I think we have to be very appreciative of the harsh geopolitical realities that each government has to confront and has to negotiate, and will actually right now is negotiating as we talk about crafting out and agreeing on the Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you.
Thank you, Governor. Just to answer the question of Ambassador Francis, as you know, I come from Brazil, and in Brazil, the import of used goods is prohibited. Cars, tires, clothes, capital goods only if there are not capital goods available in the market, similar capital goods available in the market. So this need to be linked to industrial policy of the country. So it's very important, not only for environmental issues that are very important, but also to a strategy of development considering a adequate industrial policy. So I would like to thank all the speakers of this session. It was a very productive session, and thank you very much for all the participants, all the questions that were, and suggestions that were made. And I'll give the floor to
thank you, Professor
our
Prado.
coordinator.
Thank you, Professor Prado, and to all four panelists and discussants here on the stage. There are a number of other questions that have come in. All of these will be fed into the feedback system, and which we'll be hearing more of from the organizers or the collaborators for the forum at the very end, when they give us some indications of some of the ways and means in which we will build out some of these very useful narratives. So thanks again. Let's take a 10-minute coffee break, and then we come back in for the last session, Global Diplomacy in the Caribbean. 10 minutes to shake a leg and get some caffeine.